Have you ever wondered what happens when the past, the one you fought your whole life to hide, suddenly knocks on your door, and not as a sweet memory, but as a ghost demanding to be heard? I asked myself this question the day a name returned to my life: Daniel. Decades had passed, my hair had turned grey, my body no longer had the same strength as its youth, but all it took was hearing that name for everything to come back as if it had happened yesterday. My first love, my forbidden love, the one that made me feel alive, and at the same time plunged me into the greatest nightmare of my life. I was at home on a typical afternoon when I received the news. An acquaintance from the city called, commenting almost casually, "Did you hear? Daniel's back." It was as if the ground had dropped out from under me. For years I'd hidden his memory behind closed doors. It was a secret I'd carried silently, too heavy to share, but impossible to forget. His name wasn't just a memory. It was a trigger, capable of awakening all the wounds that never healed. I don't know if you've ever experienced this, reconnecting with something you thought was buried. The feeling is like opening an old drawer and finding a letter you didn't want to read but can't put down. Suddenly your heart races, your hands tremble, and you realize you're not yet free of the past. I thought that with time, oblivion would come, but it didn't. What came was silence, disguise, the lie I learned to tell myself. And now, unexpectedly, life told me it was time to face it head-on. Daniel wasn't just anyone. He was the center of my youth, the point where everything began and from where everything fell apart. I could say it was just a teenage romance, but I'd be lying. It was so much more. He was the first man who made me feel whole, who showed me that desire and affection could exist in the same person. But he was also the one who put me in the city's crosshairs, who made me pay such a high price that I still bear the scars. When I heard the news of his return, I stood still, staring at the phone as if it were an enemy. Part of me wanted to run, to escape, to hide again. But another part, the one that never stopped remembering the smell of the wet field after training, the warmth of his hand in the dark, knew there was no escape. The past doesn't ask permission. It invades, demands. And maybe that's what you need to hear today, because it's not just my story. It's the story of many men who at some point fell in love in a forbidden way, who lived intensely and then were forced to bury it as if it were a crime. I'm speaking to you, watching me now, who are between 40 and 70 years old and know the weight of carrying a secret, who know what it's like to look back and miss something you never truly experienced. The reunion with Daniel didn't begin with hugs or smiles. It began with fear of facing what we were, fear of reopening wounds, fear of finally admitting. That first love can also be the worst nightmare. But at the same time, I felt a bitter curiosity. I needed to see. I needed to hear his voice after so long. I needed to understand if he had also borne this cross, or if he had learned to live better than I had. And this is where your participation is important, because I don't want you to just watch. I want you to put yourself in my shoes. What would you do if, after decades, you found the love that changed your life again? Would you run away? Would you run to embrace them? Or would you pretend you didn't hear the call? Write a word in the comments that sums up your reaction. This helps not only me, but everyone who still carries stories that could never be told out loud. Letting the past surface hurts, but it's necessary. My reunion with Daniel isn't just about nostalgia. It's about facing demons, revisiting dark places, facing the silence of a city that never forgave us. It's about understanding that certain choices shape not only who we were, but who we are now. And you'll discover with me, with each part of this story, that the price of first love isn't paid only in youth. It exacts its toll, again, when least expected. So, I want you to like it now. It shows that this video matters, that it needs to reach more people who still live trapped in secrets. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe now, because this story is just beginning. What follows will reveal how this love was born, amidst the risk, the desire, and the silence of a city that saw everything but accepted nothing. I remember clearly how it all began. It wasn't at a youth party or an innocent flirtation in the hallway. It was in an environment where no one imagined anything beyond discipline and routine could emerge. I was 17 and played for the local team. Soccer back then was more than a sport. It was a badge of belonging. Acceptance on the field meant acceptance into the community. And it was right there, amid worn-out cleats and the strong smell of sweat, that I met Daniel. He'd arrived, having transferred from another city, the kind of presence that effortlessly fills a space. Tall, confident, with a steady gaze that seemed to pierce through any armor. He didn't need words for me to understand that something about him would shake everything I'd known until then. At first, our relationship was marked by silence, short conversations during training, quick greetings on the way home. But gradually, these gestures became longer, fraught with a tension no one around seemed to notice. I feigned normalcy, but deep down, with each approach, my body reacted in a way I couldn't control. My heart raced, my breath faltered. Desire, disguised as curiosity, was already growing like a fire hidden beneath the ashes. The first clear sign came on a rainy afternoon. The coach was late, and we were alone in the locker room. The sound of water running down the roof was the only sound. Daniel looked at me with a look that left no room for doubt. He walked slowly without saying anything for a few seconds, until he stopped in front of me. Then he said, "You feel it too, don't you?" It was as if someone had ripped the lid off my most intimate secret. I froze, unable to respond, but he smiled slightly as if he already had confirmation. That smile was the key that opened the door I'd tried to keep locked until then. After that day, everything changed. We began to see each other in stolen moments, away from prying eyes. There were no flowers or teenage promises. There was urgency, there was intensity, quick kisses behind the storage room, hands that sought each other in the darkness of the field after training, lingering glances that said more than any words. It was dangerous, but it was addictive. It was the kind of feeling that can't be controlled, that can't be explained. First love, especially when forbidden, has the force of a whirlwind. It uproots certainties, shatters fears, builds a world of its own. That exists only between two people. But along with passion came an awareness of the risk. In a small town, every gesture was watched. Every ill-timed laugh, every lingering glance could become a rumor. And there's always someone willing to weaponize rumors. Jorge, a teammate, began observing us closely. He was the kind of guy who thrived on other people's discomfort. He laughed loudly, made cruel jokes, and liked to test his strength. At first, I tried to ignore him, but soon I realized he was the shadow haunting our secret. There was one night that stuck in my memory. After a training session, Daniel and I went to the back of the field, where there was an abandoned warehouse. That space, full of dust and rust, became a refuge. Inside, we could be ourselves for a few minutes. We were exchanging low words, almost whispers, when we heard a noise. The door slammed shut, and when we looked, Jorge was there. His look was a mixture of disgust and pleasure. He said nothing, just smiled, like someone who finds gold. In that moment, I understood that our secret had just gained a dangerous enemy. The next day, the whispers began, at first subdued, then increasingly clear. Giggles in the hallways, mean-spirited nicknames in the locker room. The field, which had been my place of freedom, became a prison. I felt the weight of every look, the threat hidden in every joke. Daniel tried to keep me grounded. He told me it didn't matter what they said, that what mattered was how we felt. I wanted to believe, but inside me fear grew. It wasn't just fear of school. It was fear of the entire city, fear that this would reach my home, my family, my future. And that's why I say, first love, when forbidden, isn't just passion, it's also a battlefield. Behind every moment of pleasure lies the shadow of discovery, the risk of exposure, the certainty that someone is ready to turn happiness into ammunition. I lived every moment torn between ecstasy and terror, between the feeling of being alive and the fear of being destroyed. You listening to me now might know what I'm talking about. Perhaps you too have experienced a hidden love, a love that couldn't be shown, but was the only thing that made sense. Perhaps you too carry memories that still make your heart race, and I want you to share this with me. Write in the comments if you've ever had to hide something so intense that it seemed impossible to bear. Write a word that sums up that experience. Love, fear, courage, secret. Your participation is not just a gesture, it's a way of giving voice to so many stories that still live in silence. And if this narrative is moving you, leave a like now. This shows YouTube that this content needs to reach more people. If you're not already subscribed, subscribe to the channel because the story is about to get even more intense. What follows will show how the rumors grew, how the city became a courthouse, and how the price of this first love began to be exacted in ways I never imagined. Back then in a small town, it didn't take much to turn a whisper into a sentence. And when Jorge caught us in that warehouse, it took just one night for the gossip to go from hallway rumors to wildfire. I no longer walked the school hallways. I walked through a courtroom. Every glance was an accusation, every muffled laugh a verdict. The entire town seemed to have been summoned as a jury for a crime I never committed, but which to them was more serious than any misdemeanor. Loving another man. At first I tried to convince myself they were just teenage comments, but I soon realized the vitriol wouldn't be confined to school. The bar where my father played dominoes, the corner bakery, the line at the grocery store, everywhere there was always someone whispering my name. I felt like before I even opened my mouth, I was already condemned. It was as if he'd lost the right to be just one more. I'd become a label, a cruel caricature, and my life was reduced to that. Daniel reacted differently. He walked with his head held high, looked straight ahead, and even seemed stronger when everyone tried to knock him down. But behind that courage, I saw the weight that also crushed him. There were nights when he would arrive silent, his face grim, and only after a long time would he confess that he had been provoked on the street, pushed against the wall by two older boys, that he had heard insults that hurt more than any punch. He stood his ground, but I knew the city was closing in, and we were both the target. The worst part was that it wasn't just young people mocking me, it was adults setting an example, teachers who remained silent, religious leaders who preached sermons against deviations, parents of classmates who forbade their children from approaching me. Even the silence in my own home was a form of accusation. My mother avoided bringing up the subject, but her gaze betrayed concern and fear. My father, rigid, turned to stone. He didn't speak, but his silence was more painful than any word of reprimand. And so, little by little, the city became a character in my story. It wasn't just a backdrop, it was an active part of the nightmare. The streets, the squares, the sidewalks, everything seemed to observe, judge, condemn. I could no longer cross the square without feeling the pressure of their gazes. Every laugh I heard behind me seemed charged with intent. It was as if the air had become denser, heavier. Living there became like breathing. Inside a closed room, where the oxygen was depleted a little more with each passing minute. There was an episode I'll never forget. One Saturday night, there was a party at the local club. I didn't want to go, but Daniel insisted. He said we couldn't hide forever, that we needed to show we weren't ashamed. I entered the room with my heart racing, trying to act natural, but it only took a few minutes for the whispers to begin. In a corner, Jorge gathered some colleagues, laughing loudly, as if waiting for just the right moment to pounce. And he came. In the middle of the dance floor, with a piece of paper in his hand, he began to read aloud one of the sentences from my notebook, which he'd stolen. When I'm with him, I feel like I can breathe. The room fell silent and then burst into laughter. I stood paralyzed. My legs trembled, my face burned. The sound of laughter echoed like a hammer. Daniel, instead of backing down, climbed onto a table and shouted, "You laugh because you don't have the courage to live your own truth." The silence lasted seconds until the boos came, even louder. Bottles were thrown, insults shouted. We left amid a storm of jeers. That night marked me like a branding iron. I understood that to the city, we weren't just different, we were enemies. After that episode, the persecution gained new momentum. At school, they began scratching my name on desks and writing insults on the bathroom walls. On the street, phrases whispered deliberately, "That's him. Look over there." On the soccer field, every practice was torture. Jorge never missed a chance to knock me down harder, to whisper insults in my ear. And the coach? Pretending not to see. No one wanted to interfere. The silence of the authorities was the license for the violence to escalate. And what hurt most was realizing there was no way out. The small town was like a cage. No matter where I went, there was always someone I knew, always someone ready to spread the rumor. It was a web of gossip and judgment from which there was no escape. What had once been just a fear of being discovered had become a real fear of surviving there. Daniel insisted that this made us stronger, that our love was greater than their evil, but I couldn't find the same faith. Every insult hurt me, every look crushed me. I felt myself crumbling inside, losing not only my joy, but also my hope. And yet, even in the midst of my suffocation, I couldn't pull away from him. The love I felt was both my strength and my weakness. And this is where I want your input. I want you who are listening now to write in the comments what you would do in my shoes. Would you face the entire city with your head held high, like Daniel? Or would you try to hide to survive, as I so often wanted to do? Write one word that sums up your choice: courage, silence, resistance, or escape. because your opinion could be the voice many still lack. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever felt the weight of being judged for loving differently, leave your like now. This shows that we need to continue bringing these stories to light, and if you haven't subscribed yet, do so. What comes next is even more intense. It won't just be the city against us, it will be the moment when the forced separation began to take shape, tearing from me what I loved most. What happened after that night in the ballroom changed the course of my life and my first love. The city was already against us, but from that moment on, something even more dangerous emerged. It wasn't just the diffuse pressure of the community, it was the concrete presence of a villain with a face, a name, and power. Jorge was no longer just a jealous teammate. He found the opportunity to transform into something greater, into an enemy who seemed to delight in watching me bleed inside. And that pleasure of his was fuel. Jorge wasn't just an aggressive boy, he was the son of a respected businessman, known for financing school and club events. His family had influence. What to many might have seemed like just teenage pranks, to him was a personal project, to destroy my image, and along with it, completely destroy me. His every gesture showed calculation. It wasn't impulse, it was strategy. When he pushed me during training, he made a point of smiling at the coach. When he spewed venomous phrases, there was always someone to swear he was just joking, but I knew, and so did Daniel. The worst part was that, little by little, the town bought into his version. Jorge was seen as a leader. He played well, spoke loudly, and knew how to approach the right people. In the eyes of the adults, he was a good guy, and we, on the other hand, were the dirty secret, the forbidden rumor. He knew how to manipulate this masterfully. He began to get close to the coach, to hang out arm in arm with the town's older men, the ones who loved to deliver moral lectures at the bar. And so, without me being able to stop him, Jorge went from being just a colleague to becoming the voice that embodied the town's prejudice. There was one incident that made it clear just how far he was willing to go. During a practice session, while everyone was already on the field, I noticed my backpack was missing from the locker room. I went looking and found Jorge laughing with two friends. He was holding one of my notebooks. It was the one where I wrote random notes, sentences I never had the courage to say out loud. Before I could take it back, he opened it and read aloud, "When I'm with him, I feel like I can breathe." His laughter echoed across the field. Some laughed along, others pretended not to hear. I was paralyzed. It was as if my insides had been exposed. The coach called them to attention, told them to stop messing around, but did nothing more. Jorge just smiled, and I understood. For him, it wasn't just fun. It was a power play. The silence of the authorities was his greatest ally. The coach pretended not to see. The school administration hid behind vague words. My family remained silent in shame. Jorge grew up in this vacuum, and every time I thought about fighting back, I remembered his position in the city. There was no way out. If I defended myself, I would be accused of violence. If I remained silent, I would be seen as guilty. It was a perfect trap. Daniel tried to pull me up. He told me, "What Jorge wants is for you to break inside. If you crumble, he wins." But it was difficult. Fear seeped into my every move. I was no longer sleeping well. Every time I heard footsteps behind me on the street, my body stiffened. I knew Jorge could appear at any moment with another dirty trick, another humiliation planned. And that's exactly what happened one night when I walked home alone. In the middle of the deserted street, I felt someone following me. I quickened my pace, but soon heard his voice. "Hey, lover, how long are you going to run away?" I looked back and saw Jorge with two friends. He held a rock in his hand, spinning it like a toy. I didn't answer, I just ran. They laughed loudly, didn't catch me, but the message was clear. It wasn't just words anymore. It was physical fear, a direct threat. When I got home, locked in my room, my hands were shaking. I knew the war was just beginning. The villain doesn't need a cape or a mask. Sometimes he wears the team's jersey, carries the surname of a respected family, and is invited to speak at events. And that's what makes him more dangerous. Jorge wasn't just a cruel boy. He was the reflection of a city that preferred to applaud violence and silence love. He was the voice of prejudice, disguised as leadership. And I wonder, how many of you watching me now have experienced something similar? How many have had a Jorge in their lives? An enemy who wasn't content to simply judge, but who made a public spectacle of their pain. If you've been through this, write a word in the comments that defines this experience. It could be fear, hatred, injustice, or even survival. Your words can give strength to those who still face such a villain today. If this story is moving you, don't forget to like it now. This shows YouTube that this content needs to reach more people who carry similar wounds. And if you're not already subscribed, subscribe to the channel, because what follows will show what Jorge did to separate us for good, and how the price of that first love became even higher than I could have imagined. Even with Jorge spreading poison and the entire city watching for any misstep, Daniel and I continued to see each other. It was as if each threat only increased the urgency to be together. Forbidden love has this strange quality. The more difficult it is, the more intense it becomes, and that's how we lived, stealing minutes that felt like centuries, as if the world could end at any moment. There was no safe place, but we created our refuges anyway. The abandoned warehouse at the back of the field remained one of them. Sometimes after a tough workout, while everyone else had already left, we would sneak back in, pretending we'd forgotten something. Inside, surrounded by rust and dust, we found the freedom the city tried to take from us. Every hug was a scream stuck in our throats, every kiss a silent challenge to the hatred that surrounded us. Daniel would look at me and say, "This is where we are true, no matter what they say outside." But it wasn't just in this hidden space that our story unfolded. We learned to transform simple moments into secret trenches, quick walks by the river when everyone else was already home, hands touching under the table at gatherings with friends, long glances at crowded parties that only the two of us could decipher. Risk was part of the game, and perhaps that was precisely what fueled the fire within us. First love is naturally overwhelming, but when forbidden, it becomes a flame that refuses to be extinguished. I remember one afternoon in particular. We left school early and walked to a dirt road that led out of town. We sat on the grass away from prying eyes and talked about the future. Daniel dreamed of leaving, starting over in a place where we could live without fear. I, more cautious, said it was impossible, that we were trapped in that reality. He interrupted me and said, "Marcos, the impossible thing is to live without being who we are. That's what prison is." Those words resonated deeply with me. To this day, when I think of Daniel, I remember that phrase echoing as an indisputable truth. But even amidst this intensity, there was the weight of constant threat. Each encounter could be our last. Each loud laugh that escaped our lips could become evidence against us. The fear was real, but the desire to be together was greater. It was as if our bodies and souls had already decided, even if our reasons screamed otherwise. There were times when I thought about giving up. The heavy silence of my house, the sharp stares of the city. Jorge's provocations made me want to disappear, but all it took was seeing Daniel to realize there was no going back. His love pulled me back to life, even when everything seemed to be burying me. Sometimes he would come to my window in the early hours of the morning. He would throw pebbles to wake me, and I would slowly descend, my heart racing. We would walk down the dark street, aimlessly, just feeling each other's warmth. On those nights, I would forget the insults, the risks. There was only him, only us. It's hard to explain to those who've never experienced it, but secret love has a different flavor. It's built of fragments, of moments that to others would be banal, but to us were everything. A handshake was a promise, a smile was a declaration, a look was a confession. We lived in pieces, but in those pieces there was an intensity I've never found anywhere else. Of course, the danger didn't disappear. Jorge kept lurking, spreading stories, trying to wring every last drop of courage from us. He was a constant reminder that at any moment everything could fall apart, but perhaps that was precisely what made each encounter even more powerful. When you feel like tomorrow might never come, you learn to live today as if it were your last. And this is where I want you who are watching now to join me. I want you to write in the comments if you've ever experienced a secret love, a love that needed to be protected from the world. Write a word that sums up that experience. Passion, secrecy, courage, or even fear. Your word can be the mirror of many stories that are still hidden in silence. And if this narrative is touching you, if it's bringing back memories or stirring emotions, leave your like now. This shows that this content needs to reach more people who have experienced or are still experiencing situations like this. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe now, because what comes next is even heavier. The moment when the price of this love began to be brutally exacted, when forces greater than ourselves decided it was time to separate us. The day everything fell apart was anything but trivial. It wasn't a giggle in the hallway, nor a stolen note. It was a direct, brutal, and indelible shock. Until that moment, Daniel and I believed we could dodge the town's hatred. We created hiding places, made excuses, learned to smile in front of others, and be our true selves, only when no one was looking. But the truth is, there's no such thing as a perfect hiding place when you live in a small town, where everyone knows everyone and any slip-up becomes a spectacle. The downfall began one night as we were returning from training. The streets were nearly empty, the cold wind biting our faces, and Daniel insisted on walking me closer to home. Halfway there, we stopped under the dim light of a streetlight. It was just another stolen moment, a quick kiss before we each went our separate ways. Only this time, we weren't alone. Across the street, standing in the shadows, was the parish priest. He said nothing, didn't approach, he just saw us. His look, filled with judgment, was worse than any insult. He turned and walked away silently. I knew in that instant we were lost. The next day, the sermon at Mass was different. No names were mentioned, but everyone understood. Young people are losing themselves in grave sins, in practices that shame the community. There are those who are dishonoring their families and dragging others along with them. There was no need to say more. Eyes turned to Daniel and me, and what had been a rumor became a formal accusation. My father arrived home with a grim expression. There was no dialogue, just a sharp slam on the table, and the words, "I don't want that kind of shame in here." The word shame echoed inside me like a sentence. My mother tried to defend me, but her strength dissolved in the face of my father's harshness and the pressure from the city. It was the first time I realized that my enemy wasn't just Jorge, nor just his teammates. It was an entire system, a machine of prejudice driven by authority figures, priests, parents, coaches, directors, who relied on each other to crush anyone who dared to be different. The weight increased days later, when Jorge and his friends decided to turn everything into a show. They were no longer content with subtle provocations. One afternoon, leaving school, they cornered me. They weren't just 3 boys. There were almost 10 of them, laughing, pushing, repeating phrases from the priest's sermon as if they were weapons. Sinner, sick, disgrace to the city. Daniel tried to protect me, but he too was thrown to the ground. The fear was no longer psychological, it was physical. I tasted blood in my mouth, my hands scraped against the asphalt, and what struck me most wasn't the pain, but seeing people pass by on the other side of the street without lifting a finger. Some just looked away, others laughed. The city's complicit silence was crueler than any punch. From there, everything escalated quickly. The team's coach called me aside. He didn't yell, he didn't insult me. He just said coldly, "It'll be better for everyone if you stop coming to practice." The translation was simple. I was expelled. The field, which had been my life, my refuge, was ripped from me. Daniel tried to protest, but he knew his fate would be the same. It didn't take long for the news to spread. They were removed for bad behavior, they said. But everyone knew the truth, and the hardest part was yet to come. My family couldn't handle the pressure. My father called me one night and said, "Pack your things. Tomorrow you're going to your uncle's house in another city. It's not going to work here anymore." There was no room for a response. It was forced exile, a punishment disguised as a solution. I looked to my mother for help, but she just lowered her head, unable to fight the decision. Daniel was the first to know. We met hurriedly behind the church, an ironic place for our farewell. His face was tense, his eyes teary. "So that's it?" he asked. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to promise we'd see each other again, that our love would endure the distance. But reality was too cruel. In that moment, I realized it wasn't just the looks or the insults that wanted to separate us. It was an entire structure, an entire city, using every tool it could to crush us. It was during that farewell that Daniel said something that would forever remain. "They can take you from me, but they will never erase what we were, never." Those words became a scar within me, an eternal reminder that love, even forbidden, leaves indelible marks. I left the next morning without looking back, feeling as though I was leaving not only my first love, but also a part of myself. And that's where I want your input. Write in the comments if you've ever experienced a forced separation, if you've ever been forced to give up something or someone because of societal or family pressure. Write a word that sums up that feeling: loss, injustice, pain, resistance. Your words can be a cry for help for many who still live under the weight of these invisible chains. If this story resonates with you, please leave a like now. This helps YouTube bring this narrative to more people who need to hear it. And if you're not already a subscriber, Subscribe now, because what follows is the moment when, now separated from Daniel, I began to understand that the price of my first love wasn't just the separation. Fate had more blows in store, and I'll show you how this shaped every step of my life from then on. The forced trip to my uncle's house seemed, in the eyes of the town, a solution to the shame my family believed they carried. For me, it was a sentence. I had no choice, no chance to fight. I simply packed my clothes in an old suitcase and, the next morning, got into my father's car. The silence inside the car was deafening. He didn't look at me once during the entire trip. There was no goodbye from my mother, no word of comfort, only the feeling that I was being removed like someone removing something unwanted from their home. On the road, every kilometer seemed to tear away my memories of Daniel. The city disappeared in the rearview mirror, and with it the last thread of hope of keeping alive the only thing that made me feel whole. I knew Jorge had won the first battle. He not only separated us, but also managed to make the city, the priest, the coach, and even my own father accomplices in his plan. Jorge was just the most visible face of something much larger, prejudice armed with fear and power. At my uncle's house, the routine was heavy. He was a serious, strict man, the kind who believed discipline was the cure-all. He woke early, worked in the local business, and expected me to be exactly like him, obedient, quiet, invisible. He never asked me why I was there, but I could see in his eyes that he knew. The neighboring town had already heard the rumors, and fame traveled faster than any bus. I was the troubled nephew, the one who was driven out of town because he lost his way. The stigma followed me like a shadow. The first few weeks were filled with absolute silence. I avoided leaving the house, avoided looking people in the eye, as if that could protect me. But deep inside, Daniel's absence burned. The nights were long, and I found myself reliving every detail. The way he smiled, the firmness with which he defended our love, the courage to face the world while I trembled inside. And it was this memory that kept me going. I needed to believe that somehow I would still see him. And that reunion happened, but so intensely it felt like a scene from a movie. A month after my move, I decided to walk to the bus station in the neighboring city. I didn't have the courage to buy a return ticket, but I wanted to feel that there was still a road connecting our worlds. It was there that I saw Daniel. He had come looking for me. He was thinner, his eyes tired, but still with that firmness that always set him apart. When he saw me, he crossed the lobby without hesitation. There were no words, just a strong, desperate hug, the kind that brings together in seconds everything that time tried to separate. We sat on a wooden bench, and he told us that things in town had gotten worse. After my departure, he became a prime target. Jorge wasn't content with a partial victory. He spread more and more rumors, inciting others to provoke Daniel, and the pressure came from all sides. Daniel's father had confronted him, demanding he deny everything. He refused. He said he wouldn't erase who he was, and he paid dearly for that choice. Threats, shoving, even being chased down the street. They want me to break, Marcos, but I won't give them the satisfaction, he said. I listened to him with a mixture of pride and fear. He was too brave for the world we lived in. The reunion rekindled everything inside me. We spent that afternoon together, wandering aimlessly through the neighboring town, as if the world were ours alone. We laughed, reminisced about hidden moments, and planned a future that seemed impossible. We talked about saving some money, about escaping to a bigger place where no one would know us. It was a dream, but for a few hours we believed it could be real. The problem is that dreams, when born on minefields, carry the risk of exploding at any moment. And, they exploded. Jorge found out about the visit. I don't know how, but he had eyes everywhere. He spread the word around town that Daniel had gone after me, that we were still in this shameful situation. When he found out, Daniel's father couldn't take it. The conflict in his home was violent. Daniel was threatened with being sent to a boarding school far away to learn to be a man. The news devastated me. I felt that little by little the noose was closing in, that there was no way to win. Back then, there was no internet to report abuse, no organized movements to protect. What existed was silence, violence, and fear. We clung to what we could. We wrote letters in secret, delivered by trusted friends, and each sentence was full of life. I still keep one of them to this day, where Daniel wrote, "They can control my body, but not how I feel about you." Simple words, but they gave me the strength to endure endless nights. I was exiled within my own life, between my uncle's rigid, routine, and the memories that haunted me, it felt like everything was coming to an end. But at the same time, there was something inside me that resisted, a small but stubborn flame. I didn't know if it was courage or just desperation, but I felt that this story wasn't over yet, that the price paid for first love wasn't just pain, but also the seed of something greater. And this is where I want you to join me. Write in the comments if you've ever experienced something similar, being forcibly removed from someone you loved, pushed away in the name of shame or honor. Write one word that sums it up: exile, injustice, separation, resistance. Your word could be the voice other men need to hear to avoid feeling alone. And if this story is moving you, if it's awakening memories or reflections, leave your like now. This shows that we need to continue bringing to light stories that have been buried by silence. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe now, because what follows will show how far Jorge was able to go, how persecution transcended borders, and how an unexpected reunion years later forever changed the course of my life. The months that followed my exile in my uncle's house were like living in limbo. I breathed, ate, went to school, helped in his business, but it was as if I wasn't really there. I was a present body and an absent soul. Daniel's absence was an open wound that wouldn't heal. The letters we secretly exchanged were my only connection to him. I read them until I memorized every word, as if that could make up for the distance, but the truth is, nothing filled the void that had formed. Daniel was more than my first love. He was the symbol of who I truly was, the part of me that couldn't be shown. Being away from him wasn't just longing. It was as if I'd lost the right to be myself. And the more time passed, the more I felt that the price of that love wasn't just separation. It was the mutilation of my identity, the theft of what made me alive. But life doesn't give us pause. While I was trying to adapt to the silence, the neighboring town had already labeled me. He was the troubled nephew, the boy who brought grief to the family. I was shunned at parties, treated with suspicion by classmates, and looked at with reservation even by my uncle's neighbors. It was like carrying an invisible mark on my forehead, a stamp that said, dangerous, different, shameful. I was only 17, but I already felt old. The world that should have been opening up before me was closing in ever more. It was in this context that an incident completely changed my destiny. One Saturday, while I was helping my uncle at the warehouse, Daniel showed up. He had traveled alone, using the excuse of visiting distant relatives. When he entered the warehouse, my heart raced. For a moment, it felt like all the weight had melted away. He was there before me, with the same steady gaze as always. The reunion was quick, almost desperate. He said he couldn't bear to be away any longer, that he needed to see me. We arranged to meet that very night in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. That encounter remained etched in my mind as one of the most intense moments of my life. The place was dark, full of dust and rust, but for us it was a temple. There was no priest, no Jorge, no my father, no entire town. There we were, just two young people trying to save what was left of ourselves. We talked for hours, talking about the future, about escaping, about trying to start somewhere else. And amidst the words, we gave ourselves body and soul. It was love. It was desperation. It was survival. It was as if we knew we might not have another chance. But no secret lasts forever. Someone saw us that night, a neighbor from the warehouse who recognized us even in the darkness. The next day, my uncle knew. The town knew too within a few hours. And then what was already heavy turned into open persecution. It wasn't just rumors or whispers anymore. Now it was direct threats. A rock was thrown through my uncle's window. An anonymous note appeared on the door. Shame doesn't deserve to live here. Daniel suffered even more. His furious father kept his promise and sent him away to live with relatives in another region under the pretext of correcting his ways. That was the final blow. There was no goodbye. There was no explanation. Just a sudden, brutal emptiness, as if someone had ripped half of me out with their bare hands. I remember running down the road as if I could reach him, but all I found was dust in the wind. From that day on, life forced me to mature in a cruel way. The boy who dreamed of an impossible love died there. What remained was a broken young man, trying to rebuild himself in silence. I entered the adult world earlier than I should have, bearing the mark of a forbidden love that the city transformed into sin and shame. I had no choice. I had to survive. I started working full-time with my uncle. I buried my dreams of playing soccer, of pursuing a career, of having a life like everyone else's. Every time someone looked at me suspiciously, I pretended not to notice. I learned to smile when I wanted to cry, to be silent when I wanted to scream. It was the only way to carry on, but inside me, the flame never went out. I still felt Daniel in every gesture, in every memory. Love doesn't die just because distance exists. It stays there, dormant, ready to awaken at the slightest sign. The following years were marked by silence and pain. I never heard from Daniel again. The letters stopped coming. The world forced me to move on. But I knew that somewhere, he still existed. I became an adult, got jobs, learned to live with loneliness. But the ghost of my first love never left me. He was present in every decision, in every relationship that didn't work out. In every night I stared at the ceiling and wondered what it would have been like if we had managed to escape. And this is where I want you to participate. Write in the comments if you've ever had to abandon someone against your will, if you've ever been forced to bury a love in order to survive. Write a word that sums it up: renunciation, pain, injustice, survival. Your word can echo the pain of many men who still live with similar ghosts. If this story is moving you, please leave a like now. This shows YouTube that we need to continue bringing these narratives buried by time and silence to the surface. And if you're not yet a subscriber, subscribe, because what comes next is even more intense. I'll tell you how, decades later, when I already thought everything was buried, Daniel's name reappeared in my life. And it was in this unexpected reunion that the past, in a brutal way, demanded to be revived. For a long time, I believed Daniel had disappeared from my life forever. The years dragged on, and that forbidden love became a kind of hidden scar that ached silently. I moved on, or at least tried. I worked in different places, carried boxes, waited tables, learned to survive. The world seemed to insist I should forget, that I should bury that part of myself and adapt. But deep down, I knew there was no forgetting. First love, especially when it's ripped away by force, never disappears. It becomes a ghost that follows every step, even when you pretend you no longer feel anything. And it was this ghost that, decades later, decided to return to haunt me in the flesh. I was already over 40 when this happened. I lived in another city, worked in a small business, and had achieved some stability. People saw me as an ordinary, hard-working man, someone who went about his life without attracting attention. But only I knew the invisible prison I carried. I never had the courage to truly come out. I never built lasting relationships. The fear, planted in my youth, had grown with me. I was the portrait of so many men who watch me today, men who also harbor secrets that have shaped their entire lives. It all began on a seemingly ordinary morning. I was at the market when I heard someone call my name. I turned and saw a familiar face, albeit one marked by time. Gray hair, lines on his face, but the same firm, deep gaze. It was Daniel. For a moment I felt the ground give way beneath my feet. My heart raced as if I'd returned to 17. I was speechless. He smiled, a smile filled with surprise and suppressed emotion. "Marcos?" he asked, and all I could answer was Daniel. We stared at each other in silence for what seemed like an eternity. It was as if the world around us had disappeared. The grocery store line, the noise of the people, everything faded into the background. There stood two men carrying a broken story, a life of unanswered questions. Finally, after so many years, we were face to face. We left and went to a nearby coffee shop. We sat across from each other, and the initial silence said more than any words, until he said, "I didn't know if I'd ever see you again." I swallowed hard, trying to organize the avalanche of feelings. His voice was different, more mature, but still had that tone that always calmed me. "Me neither," I replied. And then we started talking. I discovered that Daniel had been through a lot. His father had actually sent him far away to live with relatives in another region. He suffered alone, faced prejudice, but refused to give in. Later, when he had the opportunity, he moved to another city, studied, and built a career. He had been married to a woman for a few years, trying to fit in, but the marriage ended. "I couldn't live a lie for long," he confessed. And then he looked at me, his eyes welling up. "But even trying to move on, I never forgot you." Those words hit me like an arrow. It was everything I wanted to hear, but also everything I feared, because along with the joy of reunion came the pain of everything we'd lost. I thought of the wasted years, the lonely nights, the heavy silence I'd carried. I thought of how differently we might have lived if it weren't for the city's hatred, the harshness of our families, Jorge's accusing finger. I thought of how different our lives could have been. Daniel held my hand across the table. The gesture was simple, but for me it was as if time had stopped. Suddenly we were once again those young people hiding behind a warehouse, but now in aged bodies, marked by life and pain. "You know what's cruelest?" he said. "It's realizing they managed to steal from us the most beautiful thing we had, but they couldn't kill what we felt. That's still here." I squeezed his hand, and for the first time in years I felt like crying in public. We talked for hours. We reminisced, laughed at memories, cried for all that had been lost. But we also talked about the present, about how the world had changed, and at the same time, how certain things were still the same. He told me he had started attending support groups, helping older men deal with their own truth. I listened with admiration and shame, because I, unlike him, had shrunk, had hidden for all those years. It was then that he said something that disarmed me. "Marcos, it's not too late. It's never too late. Life has already stolen so much from us, but it can't steal what we still have left to live." Those words stuck with me. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to believe, wanted to dive back into that flame that never went out, but another part was gripped by fear, by the weight of decades of silence. That night, after saying goodbye to Daniel, I got home and couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, his words echoing in my head. "It's never too late." How many men my age live in the same prison? How many keep secrets? How many still wonder if it's worth owning up to who they are? I know you, who are listening to me now, might also carry this burden. And that's why I want you to participate. Write in the comments if you believe it's never too late. If you've already reconnected with someone from the past, or if you're still waiting for that reunion, write a word that sums it up. Hope, reunion, courage, or truth. And if this story is moving you, if it's bringing back memories or reflections, leave your like now. This helps YouTube bring this video to more people who need to hear stories like this. And if you're not yet a subscriber, subscribe now, because what comes next is the moment when past and present collide brutally. Because finding Daniel again was just the beginning. The true price of our love was yet to be exacted, and I'll show you how this reunion rekindled not only hope, but also the ghosts that had never abandoned us. After so many years away, returning to the city where it all happened was like crossing a portal into my own wounds. I was no longer the 17-year-old who carried fear with every step. I was over 50, with grey hair, the scars of life on my face, and a collection of hidden silences. But as soon as I set foot in the narrow streets, saw the square where I'd played ball so many times, smelled the scent of the old bakeries, every memory came back like a punch to the gut. It was as if time had stopped, just to force me to relive what I'd tried to bury. I returned because a family friend had passed away. It wasn't by choice, it was by obligation. But deep down, I knew this return wouldn't just be about wakes. There were ghosts waiting for me, and I sensed Daniel was one of them. I didn't know where he was, if he still lived there, if he'd survived the same pain I had, but a part of me believed that if I took a deep breath and faced the weight, fate would bring me face to face with him again. And that's exactly what happened. On the second day, when I went to the central square for coffee, I heard a voice call my name. I turned, and there he was, Daniel. He was no longer the boyish goalkeeper with his firm posture and challenging smile. He was a mature man, also grey-haired, with tired but still intense eyes. There were wrinkles on his face, marks of silent battles, but there was also something that never changed, the strength in his gaze. We stood still for a few seconds until he said, his voice low, almost choked, "I knew one day you would come back." We sat together at an iron table in the square. The silence between us spoke louder than any words, until he told me what his life had been like after the separation. His father had actually sent him to another city. He tried to force him to live a normal life, but he never managed it. He worked hard, married once, separated, had brief relationships, but confessed, "I've never been able to forget you." I listened to that with my heart racing. They were the words I'd always wanted to hear, but they also carried with them the pain of lost decades. I also told him about my life, about how I hid, about how I always lived half-heartedly, afraid of being discovered. I had worked hard, built a stable life, but I was never whole. As I spoke, I noticed Daniel looking at me with a mixture of compassion and pain. He placed his hand over mine and said, "You survived, and that's a victory in itself. But the city doesn't forget. There are always watchful eyes, always mouths ready to resurrect what should have died." Within days there were whispers. Older men in the barber shop were talking, women at the market were casting sidelong glances, and, like a ghost that never rests, Jorge reappeared, older, his body already heavy with age, but still with that venomous smile. When he passed us on the street, he shouted, "Look who's back," and he brought his boyfriend with him. People laughed. I froze. For a moment, I was once again the humiliated boy in the schoolyard. Daniel, however, didn't remain silent. He stared at Jorge and said, "You wasted your youth trying to destroy us. Are you going to waste your old age trying too?" It was a shock. Jorge laughed, but it was weak, almost bitter. For the first time, I realized that time had stripped him of the power that once seemed infinite, and yet the city once again breathed prejudice. I felt it in the weight of the stairs, in the heavy silence that accompanied me on every corner. That night, alone in the bedroom of the old family home, I looked in the mirror. I saw the man I'd become, the boy who still lived inside me, and I asked myself, how long would I be afraid? Daniel was right. Time had already passed too long. It was time to decide whether I would end my life as I'd begun, in hiding, or whether I would have the courage at least now to live my truth. The next day, I met Daniel again. We walked along the riverbank, the place where we'd so often dreamed of escaping together. The cold wind hit my face, but there was a warmth inside me I hadn't felt in years. It was there that he said, "Marcos, we're still here. They tried to bury us alive, but we're here. What do you want to do with what's left of our lives?" I remained, silent, staring at the rushing water. I knew the answer. I no longer wanted to be held hostage by fear. The following days were different. We began appearing together, without hiding. There were no public declarations, no speeches, just the simplicity of walking side by side. This in that city was already a scandal. Some ignored us, some whispered, but there were also those who looked with respect, perhaps even admiration. Some young people even approached us secretly to say, "Thank you for showing that it is possible." These words, spoken quietly, were stronger than any insult. But the city doesn't forgive so easily. A group of men tried to intimidate us, surrounding us one night as we were leaving a bar. There were no more juvenile punches, but there were veiled threats, shoves, and hate-filled remarks. I trembled, but Daniel stood his ground. "You've had your whole lives to silence us. You couldn't. You won't be able to now." The silence that followed was heavy. They walked away, and in that instant I realized the cycle was breaking. Fear no longer held the same power, and this is where you, the listener, need to reflect with me. How many times have you lived trapped in an invisible prison? How many times have you stopped being who you are for fear of judgment, for fear of what people will say? My first love was my worst nightmare, but it was also proof that no chain can erase what is true. If you've made it this far, leave a word in the comments that sums up this story. It could be resistance, it could be courage, it could be freedom. Write it down, because your word can inspire other men who still live in hiding, who still carry pain they don't share. And if this narrative touched you, leave your like now. This shows that this video needs to reach more people, that we need to keep talking about the price we pay for living in silence. If you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe now, because I still have a lot to tell. This story doesn't end here. Love may have started as a nightmare, but it was love that gave me the strength to get through life.